It is 7 o'clock. This is Sky News Tonight, and breaking news in the last hour. Plans to send 30 asylum seekers to Rwanda next week will go ahead. The High Court rules that the government's new plan to tackle illegal channel crossings can go ahead. The Home Secretary says that she will not be deterred. Well, coming up, I'm going to be joined by a panel of experts to discuss the controversial policy and this evening's decision. Also tonight, rising fuel costs and pricier shopping bills lead to 3/4 of us worrying about the cost of living on a daily basis. We report from the cities on the front line in Ukraine as the final desperate evacuations take place.
Despite all the chaos that we saw with people attempting to leave cities in the east at the beginning of the war, it's still going on. Hundreds and hundreds are coming out every single day.
Right, have you got any injuries? Whereabouts have you been stabbed?
No, not me, the neighbours.
The neighbour's been stabbed. By who?
By me.
The chilling recording of a former soldier who killed his two neighbours is played to the court in an ongoing murder trial. Plus, COVID cases rise in the UK for the first time in 2 months. But is it anything to worry about? Hi there, very good evening to you. The first flight due to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda is set to go ahead next week. The High Court rejected a legal challenge which hoped to stop around 30 people being sent to East Africa after they illegally crossed the channel. Well, the new policy formed parts of the government's plan to tackle illegal crossings and, of course, human trafficking, though it may not quite be settled yet, as human rights groups have been granted the right to appeal in 3 days' time. Well, coming up, we'll be speaking to a panel of experts about the controversial policy and, of course, the alternatives which could be out there. But first, let's talk to our political correspondent, Mari Aurora. She joins us now live. And Mari, the High Court refusing to grant an injunction just in the last half an hour or so. What does this mean, then, for next week's flight?
Yes, exactly. So as far as it looks so far, it means that flight is going ahead. Those kind of 30-odd refugees potentially going to be sent to Rwanda next week. Obviously, you can never say never until that flight does take off. There's always a chance perhaps those appeals on Monday might change things. But for now, it's happening. Now, this will be seen as a kind of a big triumph for the government and specifically for Priti Patel. It's been a really long journey for them. It's been a very difficult policy for them to get through, a controversial policy and one that was actually not necessarily loved by many of their own MPs on the Tory benches as well. So a bit of a triumph there, but also Priti Patel, she has actually reacted with a statement about this court ruling, and she said, "I welcome the court's decision in our favour and will now continue to deliver on progressing our world-leading migration partnership. People will continue to try and prevent their relocation through legal challenges and last-minute claims, but we will not be deterred in breaking the deadly people smuggling trade and ultimately saving lives." Now, that statement, obviously very strong there from Priti Patel. We can see she's pleased about that court ruling. Now, it's important to remember this isn't a court ruling on the policy. It was a court ruling on the application for an injunction to stop that flight going ahead. So it doesn't mean that the policy might potentially in the future be ruled unlawful. That hasn't actually happened yet. So it's important to remember that that is still a possibility. But I think on the government benches tonight, there will be some definite feeling of triumph there. Now, it's also important to remember that the government is under huge pressure at the moment to prove that they are kind of making good on their promises, on especially kind of manifesto commitments and promises that they've made over the past couple of years to the public. They're very, very worried about the fact that we're kind of coming into election season within the next year or so, and they need to be able to say that they have actually executed some of their policies that they said they were going to do. So Priti Patel under huge pressure there. Also, a lot of the Tory MPs, especially Tory MPs in specific seats some in the Red Wall and elsewhere, whose constituents are constantly writing to them under huge kind of pressure. It was one of the kind of top 3 things that comes into a lot of these MPs' inboxes that they're telling me is these small boats crossing. So they are under huge pressure there, and they will be exerting that pressure onto Priti Patel and the rest of the government too.
OK, Mari, thank you very much. Well, we can speak now to Jacqueline McKenzie. Jacqueline is an immigration lawyer who was a member of the independent advisory group that delivered the Windrush Lessons Learned review back in 2020. Also joined tonight by political commentator Sam Ashworth-Hayes and joined by Graham McGregor. He is campaigns manager at Detention Action. To all of you, thank you very much for joining us tonight, particularly on a Friday evening. Jacqueline, let's come to you first. We've been waiting for hours for this ruling, actually. I think it was meant to come at lunchtime. Are you surprised that the judge has decided to not grant this injunction?
I am surprised, actually, because I think, particularly with the intervention of the UNHCR, who raised some really, really valid points about, you know, the evidence that they gave to the Home Office and how the Home Office may have misrepresented that evidence. And given the extent of discourse there is about how unsafe it is to move people, so the substantive issues that I know weren't dealt with today, but I thought a judge would have erred on the side of caution, because it is only about interim relief.
Sam, what do you think? I mean, I know that I wouldn't say you're necessarily a cheerleader or a fan of this policy, but you certainly have been, backing up Priti Patel on this, haven't you?
I think it's quite a sensible approach to take in dealing with finding a way that is somewhat humane for limiting the flow of the small boats over the channel. Because if you don't have effective control of your borders, if you don't have an effective way of preventing these flows, it undermines support for the legitimate migration. And, of course, it encourages people to take what is a very dangerous crossing.
OK, and Graham, let's bring you in as well before we get to our viewers' questions. I mean, what does this mean then for the flight next week? Do you expect that it will take off on Tuesday?
Well, I think that's still yet to be seen. We're obviously disappointed by this initial decision from the High Court. We have been granted application to appeal, when that appeal will be going ahead on Monday. So we'll see what the outcome of that is. And we continue to be very concerned about the safety and the welfare of those people who are still, those 30 or so people now who are still being threatened with being sent to Rwanda. And thankfully, as part of the hearing today, 4 of the claimants in our appeal, in our request, asylum seekers who are claiming as part of our request, were taken off that flight. So that in some ways we're very relieved to hear.
Do you think it will go ahead? Do you think Jacqueline will see that flight taking off on Tuesday? Because the judge has left the door open for legal intervention.
Yes, I think what the judge wants is to hear... well, firstly, it's that there's an appeal on Monday, so we don't know how that's going to go. But, I mean, I think the information that we've now got, that 4 people were successful in their applications, is really quite encouraging, because I think the judge wants to hear more about the individual claims rather than general policies.
And the other 30, though?
Well, I think really it now needs... I mean, I think I've had some concern about the way this whole thing's been handled and the way some of the cases have been fought. And I think it is important to look at individual cases and the individual issues and bring those to court. And I think people have to work on that over the weekend. OK, now, it's an emotive piece of policy, isn't it? I know that you've all got very strong views on it. We've been asking our viewers to send us their questions, and then we've had lots and lots of them. So let's have a look at a few of them now, and I'd love to get all of you involved in this. A lot of people asking today... Sam, I'll come to you first on this. Where are most of the people seeking asylum from? Is it clear? Is there a pattern developing? I mean, would you know the answer to that anyway?
I wouldn't know it off the top of my head, but you do have sort of certain patterns in the sort of people who make these journeys, and in particular the sort of people who this policy is directed at. These are usually single young men of sort of quite a young age who are, it's viewed, sort of capable of making this journey to Rwanda and doing so safely. And they're also the sort of migrants who, when they arrive in communities, are perhaps more apt to cause some degree of social disruption. So it's sort of quite a well-targeted policy from that point of view.
Jacqueline?
What does that mean, social disruption? I mean, what on earth are you talking about? We do know where most of these people have come from because the Home Office has told us.
And where
so Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, countries like those, countries that all have major problems. We also know the vast majority of people who claim asylum in this country succeed. So, you've got the Home Office saying these are genuine refugees, and you've also got courts saying that these are genuine refugees. So why on earth are they not being allowed the privilege or the right to claim asylum in this country, which international convention allows for?
Sam?
If I just might briefly come back on that. we know where they've been most recently, which is France. Now, to my point of view, and perhaps to the audience as well, France is quite a safe and prosperous country. And
3 times as many people seeking asylum do so in France. And France actually pays €20 a week more in benefits. So the idea that people are coming here for our benefits or that they're coming here in droves isn't true. And in fact, we have about 30,000 people crossing the Channel. There are over 100 million people displaced across the globe. There are 26 million refugees across the globe. There are 5 million people seeking asylum right now. We do not have a crisis in this country.
OK, Graham, let's bring you in now. Let's talk about the legal process, as we understand this is the beginning of what could be a protracted legal process. Is it a chance for lawyers to be making money? I mean, what do you make of the legal process ahead of us?
Well, I mean, I can only speak to our legal challenge and our lawyers who are acting pro bono in this case. Our legal challenge is being funded by individual donations from the many, many members of the public, of the British public, who support what we're trying to do here, which essentially, at the end of the day, is to test the legality of a very new and very controversial government policy for which there is a lot of evidence that the Home Office and the Home Secretary have not really properly thought this through. They have not, taken their time to make sure that it is safe and that it is lawful. So, no, there's not a lot of money to be made. And, we will be pursuing our legal case through to the end. We expect it to take about 6 to 8 weeks. Today's hearing, we understand, we're still looking at the judge's decision, but we understand that part of the reason for the injunction not being granted was that the judge in the case felt that, or believed that, the people being sent to Rwanda next week wouldn't be at risk of persecution or in any risk of danger in the 6 to 8 weeks it would take to decide the more substantial case. Now, we disagree with that, but that certainly means that the judge himself is not ruling out the unlawfulness of this policy, and he's not ruling out the riskiness of this policy, the danger that it may be putting people in. He's just saying it's not going to happen in the time that it takes to hear the full challenge.
Sam, I know you've written extensively about the role of lawyers in all of this. What would you like to say about that?
I think it's just a really interesting example of the way that the sort of social and legal spheres in this country are working almost in unison to obstruct the government in its attempts to make policy. And obviously it's...
What's wrong with that?
It's obviously legitimate for people to take a view, but at a certain point it becomes about those who have the access to lawyers, who can raise the funds to pay for them, and it's sort of, you can almost set a veto on policy by sort of holding it up indefinitely through repetitive legal challenges.
Jackie, let's bring you in now, because again, we get the impression, certainly from a lot of our viewers, how people may be asking how a law and policy that is created by government, we know that it's very, Priti Patel's backing it, we know that they believe it is legal, that Boris Johnson remains confident that the policy is legal, how it's allowed to be challenged by the High Courts, and effectively, not on this case, but maybe in the days and weeks to come, a High Court judge can put a stop to it.
From time immemorial, people challenge decisions of governments and policy of governments and laws. That's how it works. That's how we get new law and new policy. And that's what's happening here. And whether you look at things, whether it's stop and search or problems in schools or so forth, things get changed. And some people are saying, and quite credible people, experts, lawyers, UNHCR, all those NGOs like Detention Action, Care for Calais, Freedom for Torture, etc., are saying this is wrong, it's unlawful, and so it has to be challenged.
Do you understand how voters can be a bit frustrated by this?
I do understand how voters can be a bit frustrated by this because they haven't...
MPs, it is one of the top things within their email inbox.
Yes, but it's no longer in the top 10 of issues that voters are concerned with. We have that evidence. I can understand why voters are concerned because they haven't been given the information. And that data that I don't want to keep rounding off those large numbers, but people really do believe that there is a crisis in this country with people seeking asylum, and there isn't one. And there's lots of things that can be done. So, for instance,
what is an alternative? I mean, that would be great to hear from you.
So, we get very small numbers to start with, all right?
10,000 this summer?
Well, yes. I mean, we had about 28,000 last year. In the scheme of 100 million people displaced in the world, we are one of the richest countries. Depending on which measurement you use, we're either the third or the fourth richest country in the world. we should be doing our bit. Now, people talk about, I mean, it's costing us so much. Well, why don't we let asylum seekers work? We've got huge shortages in this country. We had to bring in people, because as a result of Brexit, we had to bring in people to work on farms, pick strawberries, We needed butchers. Amongst all the people I've ever worked with who have sought asylum, and nearly every single one of them has got it, so have proved that they're a genuine refugee, and I've been at this for a very, very long time. You have people with incredible skills, skilled doctors and so forth, and you have people with low-level skills. The country needs these sorts of people.
Sam, it's a very valid point, isn't it? Again, an article that I read that you wrote not that long ago, you were talking about the UK being attractive because it's got such a strong workforce, or, jobs are plenty, and we know there's a need for jobs. So as Jacqueline says, wouldn't these so-called asylum seekers be fantastic in those roles?
I think that's exactly the opposite of what you want to do. If you give people the right to work and to earn income, it becomes a door for sort of a back door for economic migration, even more so than it is at present. You provide a massive pull factor for people to come from around the world. And as Jacqueline says, there's a lot of people, some currently displaced, some not currently displaced, who'd want to make use of that opportunity. We may not have numbers which are a crisis right now, we can disagree on that, but it's certainly the case that this is a phenomenon which is growing, and it's something we'd like to take control of so that we actually have a stable and secure border policy. If you give people more incentives to move to Britain through this route, then more people will come, and that's exactly the opposite of what we want.
But there's no evidence that this is growing. In fact, the numbers are down, and I know COVID has had some impact on that, but we've got to look at the data. There's a lot of, suggestions and people just making things up. We've got to really study the data here, and if we start to do that, we'll realise the problem isn't as bad as we think it is.
OK, for Graham, you've been waiting patiently, so let's bring you in with another opinion. And this being, if asylum seekers make a journey through 7 or 8 different countries in order to get to the UK, I mean, what is it about the UK? And if they're able to find safety in the likes of France, why don't they stay there?
So I think first and foremost, to repeat what Jacqueline already said, is that the UK, proportionally, even within Europe, we rank 14th in terms of asylum applications per head of population. So even taking account of the larger populations of other countries in Europe, we're still only 14th. This idea that, we're somehow taking droves and droves of people is simply not true. I would say that, we work with many asylum seekers who are held in immigration detention, and in the preparation for this case, we've spoken to many of those who are facing being sent, by force to Rwanda. Many of them have existing connections to the UK, cultural connections. They may have, there are Afghans who are supposed to be on next week's flight, who may have served as interpreters or worked with, British Armed Forces in Afghanistan. We know, for example, that there are people who are on next week's flight who have family members in the UK who've made a long journey, a very dangerous journey. We would absolutely agree that it's dangerous. They've made that long, dangerous journey to get here, only to be locked up in a detention centre, put in shackles, forced onto a plane to Rwanda and sent 4,000 miles in the opposite direction. And we think that's just unacceptable and unnecessary. The reality is that, and coming back to what Jacqueline was saying about, the data and the numbers, let's, be specific. There are no, for the vast majority of these people seeking asylum and the nationalities that they are, there are no safe routes to reach the UK, to seek asylum in the UK. There is no way to apply for asylum from another country outside the UK. This government, over the last several years, has progressively shut down or closed off or limited more and more of those safe routes that myself and many of my many other people are calling for all the time.
Okay.
We had 5,000 Syrians a year coming through safe routes. That was shut down in early 2021, and we've had none since then. There's no other way for a Syrian to get here. Afghans, after that initial evacuation recently, the government committed to opening up more safe routes for Afghans. None of those have been opened. Nothing has materialised.
OK, Graham.
And so Afghans have...
Let me bring Sam back in, because you are looking perplexed.
So I think these are almost distinct points. The availability of safe routes is fantastic. That's, I think everyone would agree that's preferable to people crossing the channel. This is about discouraging unsafe routes. So you can have distinct policies, making available safe routes for people to come here and trying to close off the routes which we really want to discourage. So I think that, to align the two...
The government is only doing one of those. the government is only introducing a deterrent and trying to punish those people who are left with no choice but to come by dangerous routes. They're not introducing safe routes. And surely I think we could all agree that if, you have to do both at the same time, or else you just end up putting people in an impossible position where they have no choice but to take a dangerous channel crossing and then are punished for things.
But if you do, in fact, think they should be doing both at the same time, then wouldn't it be more productive to push your efforts towards providing those safe routes rather than shutting off the deterrent for the dangerous routes?
We've been calling for safe routes repeatedly for months throughout the passage of the Nationality and Borders Bill. We put forward amendments to that bill with support from MPs in the House, calling for the introduction of a humanitarian visa programme that would allow people to apply for safe passage from elsewhere in the world. And the government refused it repeatedly without explaining why.
Just quickly, Sam, and then I'll come to you, Jacqueline.
But you do, in principle, think that this channel crossing route should be deterred?
We think that the way to persuade people not to take that route, or not even persuade them, because in many cases they have no choice if they want to reach the UK and have good reason to do so. We think that you offer them safe alternatives. That's the way to undermine the people smuggling model, is to provide people with what they clearly desperately need. As Jacqueline pointed out, in relative terms, even for a country the size of the UK with the population we have, it's not a large number of people. It's a tiny proportion of our annual immigration. You provide them with what they need, which is a safe way to get here and seek asylum.
I'm keen to bring Jacqueline back in. Graham, thank you. I'm keen to give... will it provide a deterrent? I mean, because Priti Patel, Boris Johnson say that they're targeting the criminal people smugglers here, and this will be a deterrent.
It won't be a deterrent, because if people are genuinely fleeing persecution, which most of them go on to prove, then they're going to flee, and they're going to find whatever way they can. And there's nothing in international conventions or international law that prevents people from doing that, even crossing the channel. We've seen an attempt at safe routes with Ukraine. It hasn't worked. So what we want are various systems. We want to be able to facilitate people who decide to take the risk in order to protect themselves, but we also do need some measures that help people come across in what we call safe routes. But, you can sort of imagine a woman in Kabul trying to find a safe route to get out of there. Well, of course it's going to be impossible. So people need to flee in whatever way they can. And when they get here, we need to facilitate that and accommodate them and treat them humanely and act within international conventions.
Very briefly, Sam, before I move to the next question.
But again, we're sort of missing a sort of point here, which is that they have already made it to Europe. They're no longer fleeing Kabul, they're now leaving France.
But they're entitled to move on. You see, international law allows that. They are entitled to move on. We know there are all sorts of reasons, historic reasons, empire, colonialism, family connections, cultural ties, why people choose this country. But we've already heard that we're way down the list in European countries that take asylum seekers, and most people don't try to come to the UK.
Let's move on. Lots of thoughts surrounding how other countries have done it, particularly the issue of Australia. We know that Australia is very tough when it comes to immigration policies. Has a similar policy worked in Australia, Sam?
It's certainly worked to deter sort of what they call the sort of boat crossings over there, although they also have quite an aggressive turn-back policy, which obviously we haven't implemented in the UK. And, yeah, they have quite a strict immigration system. I went through it when I lived out there.
OK, right. OK, Graham, what would you think? What would you add to that?
So I worked as refugee campaigner for Amnesty International Australia for 4 years. I went to Australia's offshore detention centre on Manus Island and conducted research there about the conditions and the abuses carried out against the innocent people, most of whom were refugees, who were being detained there against their will for ultimately about 7-8 years with no prospect of release. We do not want to go down that route. And that's part of the reason that we are so opposed to this Rwanda policy, is because we know where it can potentially lead. Numerous deaths, unavoidable deaths in offshore detention centres operated by the Australian authorities. Really, extensive child abuse that just went unchecked and unobserved. It really was a very grim situation. And the reality is, if you look at the statistics from Australia, Sam's not entirely wrong about those statistics, that offshore detention itself was not a deterrent. The deterrent policy itself was ineffective. In the 12 months after offshore detention was reintroduced, before the Australian government began pushing boats back, numbers of people arriving by boat continued to be about the same. It was only when the Australian government started to push back boats back to Indonesia that the numbers dropped, because of course they did, because they were pushing boats back. But of course, the reality there is that when those people are pushed back, they don't disappear. They don't vanish into a puff of smoke, as I think, sometimes people would like to think they do. They simply re-enter that global migration, that global movement of people. They're re-exposed to incredible dangers, again, at the hands of traffickers, ironically. And they're left with no alternative but to take dangerous routes once again. And many of those people that Australia expelled will have tried to make the journey to Europe and may have even, attempted to reach the UK.
OK, Graham, thank you very much. I want to give the last word to Jacqueline, if you don't mind. I mean, I'm sure you've got a comment on Australia, and also, how's this going to pan out? I mean, are we going to see, say, asylum seekers on flights to Rwanda, do you think, next week and for the rest of the summer?
I think I echo everything Graham said on Australia. I mean, everybody who's researched it have come up with the absolute horror stories. And for a country that's built on migration, I think it's really quite shocking that we're trying to emulate what they were doing, breaching human rights in every possible way. I think the government is determined to do it because it thinks it's something that its base wants to happen. I think that's why they're doing it. I don't think that in their hearts they really believe that this is a good thing to do. Nobody could possibly believe this is a good thing to do. But I think they believe it plays out to the electorate, a certain section of the electorate. And so every effort will be made, but every effort will be made by these wonderful NGOs, and all lawyers do is what they're trained to do, which is to fight cases that we think, well, if you're a human rights lawyer, which we think breach human rights, this is the courts that make the decisions. But, I think those NGOs are out there working to protect and guarantee human rights. And I think that's going to continue. So I think it's going to be a big battle. And even if this flight leaves on Tuesday, that's not the end of it. This is a long-term policy. This isn't just the Home Secretary wanting the symbolism of one plane leaving. It's a long-term policy. We understand they've been talking to Zambia and Ghana to do more of this, to have more of these deals in which we call human trafficking. So it's going to be our strategy from now on, and people are going to fight it. And at some point, there will be wins.
OK, 10 seconds to come back, Sam.
I just think it's a very effective policy for deterring extremely dangerous channel crossings. I think it's a strong deterrent for people who are, choosing their country from amongst safe havens. And I think it's...
The numbers have gone up in the last few weeks.
Yeah. It's not been implemented yet.
Well, no, but it's out there, and people know about it.
So in fact, it's better.
That's the deterrent. The deterrent is that you're saying this is what we're going to do. There's a flight booked.
But I mean, and
yet people are still coming.
But you've just told me we're going to have all of these legal challenges, and the policy may not actually happen.
Yes, but no. But people out there, or the people seeking asylum, have heard that we're going to send them to Rwanda, but they're still coming here.
Do they believe
aren't they? They don't know anything about what's going to happen in the courts. People are fleeing persecution. Do you not believe that people are fleeing persecution?
Let Sam come back.
I'm sure they're fleeing persecution, but I think once you're making the choice between living in Italy, Switzerland, France or Britain, then that stage of the journey has passed.
Not doing that, and I'm glad you said you do believe they're fleeing persecution. I think that's the end of the story. If people are doing that, we should treat them humanely.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. A really enlightening conversation. I know that this is a story that we shall come back and talk to you about again. Jacqueline McKenzie, Sam Ashworth-Hayes and Graham McGregor, thank you very much for your thoughts this evening. And, of course, that decision, Graham, thank you very much. That decision is sure to feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We're going to have our extended press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the Fleet Street Fox and Daily Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and also Freddie Gray, Deputy Editor of The Spectator. Make sure you tune in for that. You're watching Sky News Tonight. Coming up after this short break, the neighbourly dispute that ended in 2 deaths. A court hears chilling evidence of how an ex-commando stabbed a couple as their children slept upstairs.